Going to talk about forces of change in the area of public and private finance. We have Erich Zimmerman from the National Association of Regional Councils. He's here fresh from DC, where both change and stay the same time, sometimes are both at the same time. As we know that very well. He is very knowledgeable about the ins and outs of the appropriations process. Infrastructure funding is high on his watch list and will share with us his observation about that, and I know that's very important to all of us in this room. We also have Jim Ritzman, our own Pennsylvania Deputy Transportation Secretary for Planning. He will also talk with us about where things stand, in particular with public-private partnership, implementation at the state level. Jim is the top transportation planning staff for Secretary Richards, as he has been for several transportation secretaries in recent years. So let's get right into this topic. We'll start with Erich, and then we'll move right on to Jim. When Erich is finished with his presentation, we ask that you hold any questions until they're both done, and then we'll give them a chance to make their points. So, gentlemen, you want to come up here? Erich, you may as well start first.
All right.
Okay, thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. Thanks all. It's a pleasure to be here from Washington. It's hard to imagine that anything I'm going to impart to you today is going to be a greater force of change than some of the demographics we just heard about. That stuff, I think, has a lot to say. But I guess folks still think Washington is important, and so let's talk a little bit about what it is that are some of the forces of change going on there. For those that don't know who NARC is, aside from having the snappiest acronym in Washington, we also have the great pleasure of having organizations like SPC and MORPC, who's also here as members. We promote and advocate for regionalism in Washington as both advocates on Capitol Hill and also helping to display some of the great work that's being done at the regional level and make that better known. Something that I think, a perspective I think that is increasingly seen as valuable. Again, I think we're sort of into another phase where folks are recognizing the importance of regionalism and a regional approach to some of the issues that we're dealing with. So I'm going to give what I think, I don't know if it's a 5,000 or 30,000 foot overview. I think my colleague is going to get into going to take you a little bit more on the ground. But let me give you a little perspective on where I see things right now in Washington. So I'll start with overall funding, overall federal funding. Federal funding hit a real peak in 2010. After that time, a couple of factors, including something called sequestration, really took a chop on some of the federal spending until very recently. Recently, a budget deal was reached between the two parties in both chambers, and what resulted was, as you can see, a pretty significant agreed increase over the next couple of years in overall federal spending. And while inarguably this is good news, a little bit of perspective, if you look at this next chart, you see these are adjusted dollars. So in reality, while the real dollars have now increased in an adjusted manner, comparing 2010, bringing 2010 dollars up to current dollars, you see that really we're still at lower levels than we were in 2010. So we're catching up. The agreement that was recently reached is certainly an important step forward in terms of federal funding across all the agencies and all the functions of government. We still do have a ways to go to continue to sort of catch up from this from the last few years where we've seen really a reduction in the amount of spending. So that leads us to the recent Omnibus Bill. I'm sure folks heard that Washington actually got something done. Granted, it was several months late, 5 months into the fiscal year. We finally have a final bill to fund the rest of the year. It was a pretty massive $1.3 trillion package. Again, very significant increases. If you care about a program, chances are it was either level funded or most likely increased, and in some cases increased quite dramatically. Specifically in terms of transportation funding, one of the most important programs that I focus on is the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. These are dollars, some of which get directly down for local decision making. Locals make, like MORPC, like SPC, make decisions about where these dollars flow. Not only did we see full funding relative to the FAST Act, the most recent transportation authorization bill, we also saw a significant bump up, one-time bump up in this program, $1.98 billion that was added on top of this program, now flowing out through regular channels, including sub-allocated down to the local level for decision making. So that's certainly significant. There's a couple of restrictions on it. It can only be used for roads and bridges, but overall this is certainly a positive step for this year. In addition, transit and transit funding, which was certainly under assault in the president's proposed budget, also saw significant increases in funding, including for the New Starts program, which is the one that funds new transit programs as well as Small Starts. So overall, again, transit saw a fairly significant increase in its funding. For those that like the Tiger program, which is a discretionary grant program that is comes out of the Secretary's office, that program has now reached unprecedented levels of funding. They tripled the funding for this program, a program that would have been zeroed out under the president's budget. Now is going to get $1.5 billion. Up till now, it had been somewhere in the $500 million range, pretty much year in, year out, since its inception. And now has seen a significant increase in funding, including for the first time in several years, there's a certain amount of money set aside for planning funds, which we hadn't seen for a while. You can also see there's significant increases in rail, including some rail programs that previously hadn't really received a whole lot of funding from the FAST Act. Really got huge bump ups for state of good repair, some of the other things that go into rail as well. For the first time, we see actual direct funding for some automated vehicle programs to start doing some testing. DOT had previously named 10 automated vehicle test beds across the country, but hadn't provided any funding. Those will now get a little bit of funding. This is a real step forward for a Congress that frankly passed an authorization bill a few years ago that didn't even mention automated vehicles at all. And now finally we're starting to hit the ground with some funds to actually start studying how these are going to deploy. So that's again another good step forward. So that's sort of the general funding picture with a little transportation flavor. Talk a little bit about where we are overall in terms of how we're spending on transportation. Now this is actually infrastructure a little bit larger, so it also includes water. But you get a good perspective here as to the growth. You can see the state and local growth in funding for water and other infrastructure has increased quite dramatically, while federal levels are quite flat. And if you look at the period covered, the 10-year period covered here, the drop, even though there has been a little bit of a drop because of the recession, the Great Recession, the federal drop off is much steeper than you see at the state and local level. This essentially lays out kind of the same thing, although it's capital versus operations and maintenance. You can see a very dramatic decrease has happened over the last 10 years as funds have become more scarce for capital projects. A lot more money is being put into maintaining the system that we currently have. And then you can look at various ways of looking at how we have been spending money from a nominal standpoint. If you just look at straight dollars spent, we've obviously seen a dramatic increase. But when you adjust, what this is showing is that you adjust it for things like increases in the cost of materials. You can see actually we've had a pretty dramatic decrease in spending over time. Over the last 10 or 20 years or so. So these present certainly some challenges. During the campaign, the administration certainly recognized that this was an area of focus that really needed some attention. We heard a lot during the campaign about $1 trillion infrastructure package. That actually grew to $1.5 trillion infrastructure package as we got closer to a release. And on February 12th, the administration did release an infrastructure package. I want to stress it is not $1 trillion package, nor is it $1.5 trillion package. It's a $200 billion package. Quite frankly, to be perfectly intellectually honest, it was always a $200 billion package, even during the campaign. That's really what we were talking about. We were talking about a slug of federal dollars on top of the existing program, or really in addition to the existing program, that would then be used to leverage other funds to increase that total investment. So there's a broad application of these funds across we're not just talking transportation, we're not just talking water, and I'll get a little bit more into this, but it's a very broad application. The President's package does not include a trust fund component. I'll also talk a little bit about this as we go forward, but the Highway Trust Fund is struggling right now in terms of its funding. The gas tax is not keeping up in terms of its contribution to the trust fund relative to our spending levels, and that's a real challenge and is not addressed in the president's package. And quite frankly, the president did not indicate how this package would be paid for, even at $200 billion, which in Washington terms is not necessarily an enormous amount of money. You generally do need to give a nod to how it will be paid for, and there's none of that in the president's package. So it's really a package of leveraging, of financing, and then a streamlining component as well, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So $1 trillion ain't what it used to be, and I say that relative to the list of things that this $1 trillion, or now $1.5 trillion would support. You can read the list there for yourself. It really covers just about everything, including private space travel, and would be eligible under some of the programs presented. And frankly, when you get into all of the challenges we have in all of those areas, $1 trillion or $1 trillion, even $1.5 trillion gets spent pretty quickly. So what's the future potential for a package of this magnitude? So we're talking $200 billion, as I said, with leverage. In many cases, local and state dollars would have to increase. One of the things that the bill does is it does provide some funding for projects, but it requires that local areas or states provide 80% of the funding, and the federal government, a minimum of 80% of the funding. Federal government would provide the additional 20%, kind of turning on its head the traditional 80-20 federal, state, local split. And so essentially areas that could come up with funding of their own, such as a toll road or some other dedicated source like that, will certainly be at a much greater advantage to leveraging some of those dollars. And so that's about $500 billion of the $1.5 trillion. The other $1 trillion would come from leveraging private investment into the system. So it has significant increases for some of the loan programs that currently exist, and that would generate, under certain assumptions, that would generate another $1 trillion of investment into the system. So let's talk the permutations, the possibilities, what might happen with this package as we go forward. The first is we get the $200 billion as has been laid out by the president. This is certainly going to be a challenge to pass, especially in light of the recent tax bill, as well the recent appropriations bills. Quite honestly, all of those taken together are certainly going to bring debt and deficit into the forefront of the conversation in Congress going forward, so that I think $200 billion even is going to be a tough find in the couch cushions going forward. And this is assuming that we're not going to see a gas tax increase. We could talk the merits of that, whether that is or isn't true, but I'm going to assume that it's not going to happen in this Congress. The next option, and one that I've always thought was the best option, and one that I think we're already starting to see bear out a little bit, is that we get some $20 or $25 billion infusion into infrastructure. We've already seen that. That is what the budget deal was for about $20 billion into infrastructure over a 2-year period. And that we're going to see a much greater focus on streamlining, on deregulation, which has already been where the administration has been going with much of its conversation anyway. The pay for would remain unknown, though. If we look at it in the context of the budget deal, they just plowed it into deficit spending, so it's already essentially been quote unquote paid for. They don't have to come up with anything new in that regard. So that's the second possibility. I still think that probably remains. And I'll say one more thing. Speaker Paul Ryan has already indicated over the last few weeks his feeling that really what we're going to see is a series of packages, a series of bills that are going to pass. We'll see the FAA reauthorization. We'll see the WRDA, the Water Resources Development Act. They'll sort of bundle some things together that were must-pass bills anyway and call that an infrastructure package, potentially along with some streamlining provisions as well. Our hope is that these go through existing channels, as the STBGP money did in the appropriations bill. Again, this is money that flows directly down to local areas for decision making. For us, that's key. The next possibility is we see just a package of deregulatory items. I think we're already sort of past this, since we did get this increased investment in the appropriations process. But that really, this is it. We're not going to see any additional investment from here. And then possibly we get nothing at all, which in Washington is always probably the greatest possibility. We'll see where this heads over the next little while. So the Democrats, for their part, also put out a plan. I'm not going to belabor it. They've had a couple over the years. Frankly, I support this notion a lot more than I support the administration's proposal simply because it's actually an actual $1 trillion spent on infrastructure. It's not leveraged. It doesn't require states and locals to put up 80% of projects. But their pay for on this would be to make some changes to the tax bill that recently passed, take back some of the tax breaks that were that had been implemented. I don't see that as a real good possibility at this point. We'll just put it that way to be nice. A little bit about the Highway Trust Fund as we go forward, if we're talking about forces of change. This is obviously the primary way that we pay for transportation projects in this country. Supported primarily by gasoline and diesel taxes. Hasn't been increased since 1993, a couple years ago. And so as a result of that lack of increase and over time those dollars become less valuable as well. We're more efficient in the vehicles that we're driving, and all this means that what we're bringing in gas tax revenue is not keeping up with our spending levels. Fund is actually slated, so we've, as a result, have had to transfer about $140 billion since 2008 into that fund in order to keep it solvent. The fund is anticipated to go to zero in early 2021 again, but the trick is that it can't actually go below zero by congressional rules. And so it basically means if you get to that point, you have dramatic cuts in spending in order to assure that what you're spending is in line with what's coming in the door. I got to skip ahead because I'm getting the yank call already. So a couple more perspectives on this. You can see the dashed line going down is the cumulative effect over years of not raising the gas tax. So very quickly you start to get pretty significant deficits within the trust fund itself. As well, you can see here the yawn that starts to grow between incoming gas tax receipts and the outlays, and that's only relative to existing current levels of funding. If you want to increase funding, then the yawn gets even bigger and you need to come up with even more funds in order to support that. Another way to illustrate the same. So I think I'm out of time. I wanted to do a little bit of an overview about what this all means, but I think we'll have to wait for the Q&A on that. But here's those slides, and I will say that that's all for now. Thanks.
Well.